Disclaimer: this video was made with constructive and loving intent. Most of what Fireb0rn says in his charm tier list is very insightful, and he's a much better player than I am, which cannot be stressed enough. However, that doesn't mean the quality of his arguments cannot vary to some degree. You know, like every other human on the planet. So consider checking out Fireb0rn's channel using the link in the description, and with that, I'm Holland, and this is every major flaw in Fireb0rn's Hollow Knight charm tier list. Right off the bat, Fireb0rn doesn't specifically state on what grounds he's ranking these charms. That's a problem because it means I have to infer his ranking criterion, which I think goes something like this. Charms that rank higher on the tier list will be considered generally more useful in combat. Why only in combat? Well, because of something Fireb0rn says a bit later on.
It's still kind of hard to rank it because you can't really rank a movement charm with other combat charms. You can't compare it to other charms because you're just using it to move around the map.
I'll touch more upon this later. If this is indeed how Fireb0rn is judging these charms, his tier list may help provide a general overview of which charms are worth using in combat and which ones aren't.
We started off the tier list, Grimmchild's already at the bottom, and that's probably going to be one of the worst charms in the game. So Grimmchild, I'm sorry, but you are a D tier charm.
I think that's a pretty fair ranking, however you provide no context for this placement other than a clear hatred for the charm. It would have been great with just a few words on why you hate this charm so much.
Now Kingsoul costs 5 notches. It isn't available for most of the game, and then by the time you get it, you just replace it with Voidheart.
Pointing out that Kingsoul isn't available for most of the game and is then quickly replaced by Voidheart is obviously noteworthy. However, with the previously established ranking criterion, this shouldn't affect the charm's rating. Should Unbreakable Strength be ranked lower on the tier list because it's hard to get? And by the way, I'm not saying that this point does affect Fireb0rn's rating of the charm, just that it seems like it might have.
Grubsong costs 1 notch and gives you 15 soul when you get hit, which is generally a lot in this game. This gives you 4 soul every 2 seconds.
That Grubsong comparison, while good at spotlighting the huge difference between the potential soul gain of these charms, does miss some nuances. Most notably the fact that Kingsoul has no requirements, while Grubsong only triggers after getting hit, which can be quite a huge penalty, especially, and quite obviously, for Radiant boss fights.
And it costs 5 times the notch cost of Grubsong. So I wonder which charm is better.
See, it's this expression from Fireb0rn that makes me wonder whether he got a bit carried away with that comparison. Again, it's a fitting point. However, I believe it does dramatically simplify the strengths of Kingsoul, even if I would agree that Grubsong is generally a stronger charm.
Generally, this charm doesn't matter that much because you're not going to use it because you're going to replace it.
Again, I don't understand why this point would count against the charm's placement on this tier list. It is, after all, possible to obtain Kingsoul and use it in Godhome, and even if most players don't do that, that doesn't seem to me a proper argument against the charm's ranking. At least not given the criterion Fireb0rn seems to be using. I'm making these points only because Kingsoul ends up so far down on the tier list. I do understand not thinking very highly of the charm, however I cannot get behind placing it just above Heavy Blow and right below Glowing Womb.
All you need is Shaman Stone and you've got a spell build. Male builds require several charms to be really strong. Spell builds just need Shaman Stone.
Okay, so although Fireb0rn may be totally right in saying that Shaman Stone is the best charm in the game, I think this specific piece of logic is flawed. You can argue that all you need for a spell build is Shaman Stone, but I think you can also argue that all you need for a nail build is Strength. Now, both of these builds benefit greatly from supporting charms. Notably, Quick Slash increases both nail damage and soul gain, slotting wonderfully into either build. However, saying that Shaman Stone is a better charm than Strength because Shaman Stone is the only charm you need for a spell build is to me a flawed argument. Instead, I think you have to compare the damage increase of each charm. According to the wiki, Strength boosts the damage of the nail by 50%, while Shaman Stone does about the same. Less damage for Vengeful Spirit and Shade Soul, but they get the size increase to help with multi-hits, so it more or less evens out. Okay, so that's a 50% damage increase to your nail from Strength, and a 50% damage increase to your spells from Shaman Stone. Does that make the two charms equally powerful? Well, you could argue that it doesn't, since Shaman Stone's percentage increase is more impactful on the already harder hitting spells. But on the other hand, you could also argue that Strength gains the largest benefit, since nail swings come out faster and don't require soul. Okay, so all that is to say that in my opinion, a comparison of the two charms' damage numbers is crucial to determining which of them is better. This is just a guess, but I think Fireb0rn might have felt that Shaman Stone was more powerful because it's the only charm that directly increases spell damage, while the nail gets both Strength, Quick Slash, and Fury of the Fallen. But just because Shaman Stone is the only charm that increases your spell damage, doesn't mean it logically follows that it's more powerful than a charm like Strength. So perhaps the ranking is apt, although I think it's less so about Shaman Stone being the only charm needed for a spell build, and more about the raw numbers of each charm.
And consider, like, for example, if you have Spell Twister on as well. Spell Twister makes it so spells cost 24 soul instead of 33. So if you're getting 19 per hit, you're almost getting enough soul for a spell with every hit if you're using Spell Twister as well. So it's just such a strong effect.
I think you have to be careful with such thought experiments. If you take Spell Twister into consideration, you're no longer just talking about Soul Eater, which might lead to an unfair judgment. It's similar to, as in the previous example, comparing Shaman Stone to Strength and Quick Slash combined. You have to evaluate each charm on its own merits, or at least take into consideration that Soul Eater plus Spell Twister is now a 6-notch cost charm instead of a 4-notch cost charm. So there's nothing inherently wrong with this comparison, I just think it can easily misrepresent the power level of Soul Eater.
So it's just such a strong effect, especially against bosses where Soul is like a little bit more hard to come by. Soul Eater is just really strong.
I guess I should also briefly touch upon this. I'll admit I'm on less firm ground here, so definitely correct me if I'm wrong about this. Why is Soul Eater better against bosses where soul is harder to come by? So I imagine Fireb0rn is talking about bosses like Collector or Failed Champion who don't give soul when hit. Except he can't be talking about Failed Champion, since you can stall him infinitely to get unlimited soul with the Dream Nail. Okay, so maybe Soul Eater is better against the Collector, since you can only gather soul by hitting summoned enemies. But is that really true? In this case, is Soul Eater really a better charm than, say, Strength? Strength helps you both slay the summons and the boss faster. And since you get full value from Strength, compared to Soul Eater, which only works against the adds, wouldn't you say that Soul Eater was weaker in this fight? In this fight where soul is harder to come by? I hope you can see what I'm getting at.
It's still kind of hard to rank it because, like, you can't really rank a movement charm with other combat charms. Like, you can't compare it to other charms because you're just using it to move around the map.
I've already talked briefly about this, but I just wanted to say that I absolutely agree with Fireb0rn's argument here, and I think that it's a great point to make. Charms like Wayward Compass and Gathering Swarm simply don't make sense to rank in a tier list such as this one, because you need a ruler to measure every charm against. Now, you could propose a measurement of, let's say, general usefulness, but that's such a wide scope of judgment that you're most likely not going to pass on much useful information with your tier list. So, props for pointing that out, and to the extent that Dashmaster is useful in combat, I think it should be rated as such in this tier list, ignoring its capabilities outside of combat.
So, it's hard to rank it, but we'll throw it in the B tier, because the B tier is lonely.
Ah, well, I'm not sure that was the move. With such a high placement, you're communicating that Dashmaster is about average in terms of combat utility, which you just made it sound like was not your opinion. That is, again, why I believe it's super important to spell out on exactly what grounds you're rating the charms. Is it combat utility? General usefulness? Platforming? If you don't specify this at the start of your tier list, we're all gonna end up arguing past each other.
I would say Greed is within the D tier, but probably more useful than Defender's Crest, I guess.
Okay, well, I think this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. Obviously, Greed has no effect on combat, and therefore can't be better than a charm like Defender's Crest, unless you think Defender's Crest is actually worse than having no charm. Listen, my honest opinion about this ranking is that Fireb0rn just didn't think too much about exactly what he was rating each charm on. And that's fine, but I do actually think a tier list needs defined measurement criteria to have any actual validity. But again, I love you, brother. No ill will towards Fireb0rn. This is all just for fun.
Okay, next up is Grubberfly's Elegy. Now, this charm requires you to save all the grubs in the game, and in that sense, it's suboptimal.
In that sense, it's suboptimal? I really wonder why that's a valid consideration in this tier list, because now it sounds like Fireb0rn is evaluating by still new criteria. It shouldn't matter how hard a charm is to acquire if we're just talking about how powerful it is. Again, this makes me wonder about on exactly what grounds these charms are being judged.
So 1.64 times DPS increase in your nail damage with one charm. That's more than Unbreakable Strength.
Hold on, but doesn't that make it statistically better than Strength then? I actually don't necessarily think so, since it's sometimes hard to weave more than a single hit in on a boss, but we need Fireb0rn's take on this and not mine. Otherwise, he's making it seem like Quick Slash should be rated above Strength, which it isn't.
And also the damage just ain't enough. I'd expect it to deal 2 times, maybe even 3 times, or 2.5 times perhaps, your nail damage when you hit an enemy successfully with it.
I sure wish somebody reworked the charm to do exactly that. Oh boy, wouldn't that be lovely? Maybe that somebody even put a link in the description. How devious.
If you're using it to travel around Hollownest, yeah, sure.
Hollownest. Alright, and that's it. There were a few lesser points I wanted to touch on, but Fireb0rn's video was quite obviously unscripted, so I didn't want to get too nitpicky. Although I think Fireb0rn fails to properly establish what he's actually rating these charms on, I still think this is a great video. And if we consider these charms as being listed by power in combat, the tier list is very useful, and I personally agree with it almost completely. I think Fireb0rn argues his points well, and considering the short length of this video compared to the hour and 20 minutes of the original, it's safe to say that logical errors are far and few between. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and check out my Reworking Every Charm series if you want to see me fixing all of these charms. And of course, don't forget to check out Fireb0rn's channel, a link to which can be found down below, as well as the original video, which you should definitely watch if you haven't already. And have a wonderful day. Bye!